Before you decide what justice looks like, subscribe, because once the prison doors close on this case, the truth won't come out easily, and what you're about to hear will stay with you long after the cell lights go dark. The alarm didn't sound all at once. It crept through the high-security prison in layers. First a sharp electronic chirp, then the metallic howl that rolled down concrete corridors like a warning meant for the bones. Cell block D was already awake. It always was. Men on death row slept lightly, if at all, their days measured by counts, keys, and the distant echo of boots. Fluorescent lights flickered to full brightness, washing over steel bars and narrow cells where tattooed arms hung from bunks like exhausted flags. The smell was the same as always: bleach, rust, old sweat, and something sour that never quite left the place. Prison guards moved fast, radios pressed to their shoulders, eyes trained on doors and corners. A lockdown had been ordered, and no one yet knew why. In a USA prison story like this, lockdowns didn't come without reason. Something had already gone wrong. In cell D17, the body sat unnaturally still. The inmate assigned there had been on death row longer than some of the younger guards had been alive. His name was known across the facility, whispered by inmates with tattooed necks and forearms, as if saying it too loudly might bring bad luck. He had lived in that cell for decades, under constant prison surveillance, watched by cameras that never blinked. Yet when officers looked through the narrow window in the reinforced steel door, they knew immediately that routine had been broken. The man sat upright on the edge of his bunk, hands resting neatly on his knees. His arms were a map of faded tattoos, prison ink layered over prison ink, dates, symbols, names scratched deep by hands that no longer trembled. His eyes were open, fixed on the wall opposite him. There was no blood, no sign of struggle, just silence, and the heavy certainty that whatever had happened in that cell was about to trigger a jail investigation that would reach far beyond these walls. "Don't touch anything," one guard said, his voice low, tight. He'd been working death row long enough to recognize moments that followed you home. Word traveled fast, even under lockdown. Inmates leaned close to their bars, tattooed fingers wrapped around cold steel, eyes sharp with criminal psychology sharpened by years of confinement. A death on death row before an execution date was rare. A discovery like this, quiet, controlled, and unexpected, sent ripples of tension through the cell block. Across the tier, another inmate watched from the shadows of his cell. His shoulders were thick with inked symbols, crude flames licking up his neck. He had been awake before the alarm, listening to the building the way seasoned inmates did, attuned to every unusual sound. When the sirens started, his first thought wasn't fear, it was calculation. Whatever had happened in D17 was going to change things. Guards sealed the block within minutes. Doors slammed shut in sequence, the echo bouncing off concrete. A prison lockdown always carried its own rhythm. Keys clattering, radios crackling, boots moving with rehearsed urgency. The men inside the cells fell quiet, not out of obedience, but instinct. Silence, in moments like this, was survival. Investigators arrived while the lights were still harsh. They moved with practiced restraint, stepping carefully into the cell, documenting everything. The bunk, the sink, the toilet bolted to the floor. Nothing appeared disturbed. No signs of a jail escape attempt. No broken fixtures, no hidden tools. It was as if the inmate had simply decided to sit down and stop breathing. That explanation satisfied no one. This was a high-security prison, designed to prevent real prison escape and control every aspect of an inmate's life. The man in D17 had been searched regularly, monitored constantly. His schedule was rigid, his movements minimal. For something to happen without triggering an alert raised uncomfortable questions about procedures, oversight, and whether the system itself had failed. As the investigation began, attention turned to the surrounding cells. Who had been awake? Who had heard something? Who had seen something they weren't supposed to see? Tattooed inmates answered questions with the same careful vagueness they perfected over years of inmate interrogation. No one volunteered information. No one ever did. One inmate, housed 2 cells down, stared straight ahead as officers passed. His forearms were covered in dense black ink, symbols tied to a prison gang that no longer officially existed, at least not on paper. He had a reputation for keeping his mouth shut, even under pressure. But his jaw tightened when investigators paused near his door, and that small reaction didn't go unnoticed. The guards knew the dynamics of this tier. Death row wasn't chaotic like general population. It was quieter, more controlled, but no less dangerous. Tension simmered instead of exploding. Every man here had already been condemned. What they did with their remaining time depended on deals, grudges, and unspoken rules enforced by proximity and memory rather than open violence. As hours passed, the cell block remained sealed. Meals were delayed. Showers canceled. The stillness pressed in, broken only by the hum of ventilation and the distant clang of doors elsewhere in the facility. Inmates with tattooed chests and arms paced their cells, counting steps, replaying rumors forming in their minds. Outside the block, senior officials reviewed surveillance footage. Camera angles overlapped, timestamps synced, feeds rewound again and again. The man in D-17 had been visible throughout the night, sitting, standing, lying down. Nothing out of the ordinary. No visitors. No suspicious movement. No blackout. And yet, something critical was missing. A guard with years of experience leaned closer to the monitor, narrowing his eyes. "Run that again," he said quietly. On the screen, the image flickered. The camera covered the tier from an elevated angle, capturing the front of each cell. At 2:14 a.m., the man in D-17 stood, stretched, and sat back down. At 2:15, the feed jumped, just a fraction of a second, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. At 2:16, everything looked normal again. "That skip," the guard said. "That's not supposed to happen." Technicians checked the system logs. The cameras were supposed to be redundant, backed up, uninterrupted. A gap, even a brief one, suggested interference or negligence. Neither explanation sat well in a prison where every second was accounted for. As the discovery spread through internal channels, the language changed. This was no longer a routine death. It was now a matter involving prison surveillance integrity, staff accountability, and potential criminal motive. A law enforcement pursuit began, not outside the walls, but inward, toward the systems and people trusted to maintain control. In the cell block, inmates sensed the shift. One man, his face lined and heavily tattooed, pressed his ear to the door, listening to footsteps. He'd spent years studying guards the way others studied books. He knew when routines were breaking down. Today, they were shattered. Late in the afternoon, investigators returned to D-17 with fresh eyes. A second search, slower, more invasive. They checked seams, fixtures, vents. When one officer ran a gloved hand along the underside of the metal bunk, his fingers paused. There, barely visible, was a thin scratch, newer than the rest, deliberate. They followed it to the wall. Behind a layer of chipped paint, concealed in plain sight, was a shallow cavity, too small to hide a weapon, too precise to be accidental. Inside lay a folded piece of paper, yellowed at the edges, handled enough times to soften its creases. No names were written on it, just numbers, dates, and one phrase repeated twice in careful block letters, as if written by someone who wanted no mistakes. Not an accident. As the paper was logged into evidence, the reality settled over the room. Whatever had happened in that cell wasn't just about one man's death. It was connected to something older, something buried beneath years of routine and silence. A case that had already passed through courts, appeals, and public scrutiny was about to reopen, this time from inside the prison itself. Down the tier, an inmate with a tattooed skull etched across his forearm smiled faintly to himself, unseen by the cameras. He knew exactly what that note meant, and he knew that once the truth started moving, there would be no way to stop it. The prison doors stayed locked as night fell, the blue-toned gloom settling back over cell block D. Investigators stepped out, evidence secured, questions multiplying. Somewhere between the concrete walls and the flickering lights, the first crack had appeared in a story America thought it already understood. And now, the case that led a man to be executed after decades on death row was no longer finished. It was just beginning. The investigation didn't announce itself to the men inside cell block D. It seeped in quietly, the way pressure builds behind concrete walls. Lockdown remained in effect into the second day, and the prison took on that suspended feeling inmates knew too well, the sense that time had slowed, but consequences were accelerating. Guards rotated in shorter shifts now. Fresh eyes, unfamiliar footsteps. Radios stayed clipped close, volume low, voices coded. The prison administration had sealed off not just the tier, but access to surveillance controls, maintenance logs, and staff movement records. This was no longer an internal review. It was a full jail investigation, and everyone inside the perimeter could feel it tightening. Inmates with tattooed shoulders and forearms watched the changes with practiced awareness. They knew when routine was being replaced by scrutiny. Trays slid through slots later than usual. Counts took longer. Officers lingered in front of cells, eyes scanning faces as if searching for cracks. In D-19, a tattooed inmate sat cross-legged on his bunk, tracing the outline of an old tattoo with his thumb. Inked dates ran down his arm. Court appearances, appeals denied, milestones of a life measured in failures. He had known the man in D-17 longer than anyone else on the row. Not as a friend, not even as an ally, but as a constant presence. Death row relationships were built on proximity, not trust. When an investigator stopped outside his cell, the inmate didn't look up. Night of the incident, the investigator said, voice calm. Anything unusual? The inmate shrugged, tattoos shifting under his thin shirt. Every night's unusual in here. The answer was expected. Still, the investigator waited. Silence stretched. Criminal psychology taught patience, especially in environments where power dynamics were inverted by time and familiarity. You hear anything? The investigator asked. Just the building, the inmate replied. This place talks if you listen. That was as close to cooperation as anyone had offered. Across the tier, another inmate reacted differently. His tattoos were newer, darker, covering his neck and knuckles in sharp angles that marked former gang affiliations. He stood too close to the bars when questioned, eyes fixed on the badge, jaw tight. His answers came quickly, too quickly, rehearsed. Investigators noticed. They always did. Behind the scenes, surveillance analysts worked through hours of footage from adjacent blocks, cross-referencing movements. Guards' patrol routes were mapped minute by minute. Maintenance access logs were pulled. Every key swipe, every door opened, every camera recalibration was scrutinized. One anomaly kept resurfacing. A maintenance check had been logged on Cell Block D's camera system 3 days before the incident. Routine, on paper. Signed off by a technician who'd worked the prison for over a decade. No prior issues. No flags. Yet the timestamp didn't align with his usual schedule. When questioned, the technician seemed genuinely confused. He had tattoos too. Prison culture didn't stop at the bars, and his ink told its own story of past mistakes and second chances. He insisted he'd performed the check earlier than logged. Blamed the system. Blamed human error. Investigators didn't argue. They noted everything. The deeper they dug, the clearer it became that the prison's internal politics were as layered as any street organization. Guards had alliances. Inmates had hierarchies. Information moved through unofficial channels faster than through official ones. One name surfaced repeatedly in whispered conversations among staff. A senior guard who'd transferred out of death row months earlier, just before the inmate in D-17 received his final execution date. His record was clean. Too clean. No complaints. No incidents. But his patrol patterns, once overlaid with surveillance gaps, raised questions. Inside the block, tension grew heavier by the hour. Tattooed inmates paced, worked push-ups, stared at walls worn smooth by decades of waiting. Rumors traveled through knocks, glances, coded phrases slipped during brief interactions with guards. Some said the man in D-17 had been protecting someone. Others claimed he'd threatened to talk, to reopen his case, to expose something buried in old transcripts and sealed evidence. Most dismissed it as death row mythology. But even myths had roots. The investigation expanded beyond the prison walls. Old case files were pulled from storage. Trial records were reviewed. Transcripts reread with fresh skepticism. The case that had put the man in D-17 on death row was decades old, built on circumstantial evidence, a contested confession, and testimony from a jailhouse informant who'd since disappeared into the system. Back then, the conviction had felt solid enough. Appeals failed. Clemency denied. The machinery of justice moved forward. Now, investigators noticed details that had been overlooked or ignored. Evidence logs with missing signatures. Interview notes that didn't match audio recordings. A brief mention of a witness who'd recanted, then vanished from the record. Inside the prison, an inmate with heavy tattoos across his scalp watched guards escort another man down the tier for questioning. He recognized the look on the man's face, fear mixed with resolve. That look usually came when someone had decided whether to talk or stay silent. The inmate leaned back against his bunk, eyes closing. He'd made his own choice years ago. Choices were expensive in places like this. During a late-night review session, an investigator replayed footage from a different angle, one not directly covering D17, but the corridor leading to it. At 2:13 a.m., a shadow passed briefly across the frame. Too quick to identify, too deliberate to dismiss. The investigator froze the image, enhanced it. The shape suggested a person pausing just outside camera range, then stepping back. A guard silhouette, possibly, or someone wearing a uniform. That possibility changed everything. If staff had been involved, directly or indirectly, the investigation would tear through the prison like a fault line. Trust would fracture. Control would weaken. The administration knew it. So did the inmates. By the third day, cell block D erupted, not in violence, but in noise. Tattooed men shouted questions, accusations, half-formed threats. Guards responded with authority, ordering silence, reinforcing lockdown protocols. The tension felt like a held breath. In D21, an inmate slammed his fist against the door, tattoos blurring as he moved. "You think this just happens?" he yelled. "You think men just die quiet in cages?" A guard met his stare, unflinching. "Lock it down," he said to no one in particular. Later, during a controlled movement for medical checks, two inmates crossed paths under watchful eyes. One leaned in just enough to whisper, his tattooed lips barely moving. "He left something behind," he said. The other didn't respond. He didn't have to. That night, investigators returned to the evidence recovered from D17's cell. The note, the numbers, the dates, cross-referenced against trial records. One date matched a suppressed hearing, one that had never reached the jury. Another matched the death of a key witness under suspicious circumstances years after the conviction. The phrase repeated on the paper, "not an accident," took on new weight. In the prison, a guard sat alone in the break room, staring at his hands. Tattoos peeked from under his sleeves, reminders of a past he'd tried to outrun by putting on a uniform. He knew what the investigators were finding. He'd known for years. The question was whether silence had made him complicit. As dawn approached, an emergency meeting was called among senior staff. Protocols were revised. Certain officers were reassigned pending review. Word spread fast. On cell block D, an inmate with a tattooed cross etched into his forearm pressed his face to the bars as footsteps approached. He smiled thinly when he saw who it was. They were finally asking the right questions. And somewhere deep in the prison's archives, a file marked closed was pulled from its shelf, dust shaken loose as it was opened for the first time in decades, revealing a name that no one expected to see connected to the case. The direction of the investigation had just changed. Pressure inside the prison didn't rise all at once. It crept, tightening hour by hour, turning routine into threat. By the fourth day after the discovery in D17, cell block D felt less like a controlled environment and more like a sealed container under strain. Lockdown protocols remained in place, but the tone had shifted. Guards moved in pairs now. Hands stayed closer to batons and radios. Prison surveillance was no longer background noise. It was an ever-present eye, watching not just inmates, but staff. Everyone knew the investigation had crossed a line where no one was untouchable. Inmates with tattooed arms and necks sensed it immediately. Men who had survived decades in high-security prison settings understood institutional fear. It showed in small ways. Guards avoiding eye contact, supervisors overcorrecting minor infractions, sudden rule changes explained as temporary measures. The system was protecting itself. Inside his cell, an inmate with thick black tattoos wrapping both forearms sat on his bunk, listening. He'd learned long ago that silence carried information. Voices echoed differently when people were nervous. Footsteps hesitated where they used to be confident. Doors opened a fraction slower. He smiled faintly. Someone had made a mistake. The investigation team split its focus. Half worked outward, reviewing old case files, re-interviewing retired law enforcement officers tied to the original conviction. The other half turned inward, applying pressure where it hurt most, daily operations. Randomized searches increased. Guard schedules were altered without notice. Maintenance access was restricted. That was when things started to disappear. A routine evidence review revealed that a minor logbook, one used to track camera calibration adjustments, was missing from storage. It wasn't classified. It wasn't dramatic, but it was specific to the exact system that had glitched the night the man in D17 died. When questioned, no one admitted taking it. When searched, it wasn't found. Inside cell block D, inmates noticed the ripple effect immediately. Searches became more aggressive. Personal items were removed and cataloged. Tattooed inmates were ordered to strip down to undershirts while guards checked seams, books, even legal papers. The process was humiliating by design, a reminder of control. But control was slipping. In D22, an inmate with a web of old tattoos across his chest refused to step back from the bars during a search. His voice stayed calm, almost amused. "You're looking in the wrong places," he said. A guard snapped back, ordering him to comply. The inmate did, but the comment lingered. Criminal psychology thrived in environments like this. The more pressure applied, the more behaviors shifted. Some inmates withdrew completely, turning inward, staring at walls. Others became louder, more erratic, drawing attention to themselves to divert it from elsewhere. Investigators noticed one pattern quickly. The inmates who had known the man in D17 the longest were saying the least. Their statements were consistent, almost rehearsed, stripped of detail. It wasn't loyalty. It was strategy. Late one evening, a guard failed to report in during a routine check-in. Protocol dictated immediate response. A supervisor found him in a staff corridor, shaken but unharmed. He claimed he'd slipped, dropped his radio. A simple explanation. Except his radio was found 2 floors away. Security footage showed him stopping near cell block D's control junction, the same area where maintenance access was logged days earlier. When questioned again, his story shifted slightly. Not enough to accuse, but enough to register. Word spread fast among inmates. In D19, the inmate with the faded date tattoos leaned against his wall, ear pressed close. He'd heard the guard earlier, heard the panic under the uniform. He exhaled slowly. Fear-like that didn't come from slipping on concrete. It came from being caught between orders and truth. That night, tension spiked. A loud bang echoed down the tier, metal striking metal. Guards responded instantly, flooding the block, shouting commands. An inmate in D25 had smashed his sink, flooding his cell in what looked like a spontaneous outburst. He was restrained and removed, tattoos twisting under restraint straps, shouting incoherently about being set up. But investigators reviewing the incident noticed something else. While attention focused on D25, surveillance showed a brief interruption in coverage near the staff corridor. Not a full blackout, just enough for someone to move unseen. It was a jail escape attempt of a different kind, not inmates trying to flee, but information trying to disappear. The investigation team regrouped. Someone inside the prison was actively interfering. Evidence didn't vanish by accident. Systems didn't glitch themselves. And fear was spreading too selectively. They began to map relationships. Which guards worked which shifts? Which inmates had contact with which officers? Who'd been present during critical moments years ago, during the original trial, the early incarceration, the long appeals process? One name surfaced again. A former investigator tied to the original case had later taken a consulting role with the corrections department. Not unusual. His signature appeared on several procedural reviews over the years, including one involving death row operations. He'd retired quietly. Investigators requested his records. Inside the prison, a tattooed inmate with sharp, angular ink along his jawline watched as a guard he recognized was reassigned mid-shift. The guard avoided his eyes. That told him everything. Reassignments like that weren't punishment. They were protection. The inmate lay back on his bunk, staring at the ceiling. He remembered a conversation from years ago, shouted through bars during a lockdown long forgotten. The man in D17 had said something then. Something about timing, about patience. About how the truth aged like concrete cracks, slow, but inevitable. Pressure peaked when an evidence envelope went missing. It contained photocopies of suppressed interview notes from the original trial, notes tied to the numbers found in the cell. The envelope had been logged, signed, and placed in a secure cabinet. Now it was gone. That triggered an emergency response. External oversight was notified. Internal affairs stepped in. Guards were pulled from duty for questioning. The prison's sense of order fractured openly. Inmates felt it like electricity. In D21, the man with the tattooed cross leaned close to the bars as investigators passed. "You're running out of time," he said softly. One investigator stopped. Met his gaze. Why do you say that? The inmate smiled, revealing nothing. Because someone already decided who takes the fall. That night, a guard was assaulted, not seriously, but deliberately. Pushed down a stairwell, bruised, shaken. No witnesses. Cameras malfunctioned in just one section. The message was clear. The investigation was no longer academic. It was dangerous. In response, investigators accelerated. They cross-checked retirement timelines, financial disclosures, old disciplinary records buried in archives. Patterns emerged, small favors, overlooked violations, decisions made quietly and justified later. Near dawn, a breakthrough finally came. A technician recovered a partial backup from an off-site server, one never meant to be accessed during routine operations. The footage was corrupted, fragmented, but usable. It showed the corridor near D-17 at 2:15 a.m. And this time, the shadow had a face. The image froze on a figure in uniform, stepping just outside camera range. Someone who should not have been there at that hour. Someone still employed. As the investigators stared at the screen, understanding settled in. The death on death row wasn't the beginning of the story. It was the last move in a much older game. And now that the pieces were visible, the prison was no longer just a setting. It was a battlefield where truth, loyalty, and survival were about to collide. The prison didn't resist the truth all at once. It fractured around it. By the time dawn broke after the recovered footage, the atmosphere inside the facility had changed from tension to inevitability. The kind that settled when everyone knew the story was already written. Only the order of its telling remained. Investigators worked without pause. The blue-lit corridors outside cell block D became arteries of movement, carrying documents, drives, and sealed envelopes from one secured room to another. The name attached to the uniform in the recovered frame was verified twice before anyone said it aloud. A veteran corrections officer. Still active. Still trusted. Still moving freely through a system that now realized how exposed it had been. They didn't confront him immediately. Criminal psychology favored patience. The truth, when rushed, tended to splinter. They wanted it whole. Inside death row, tattooed inmates sensed the shift before any official announcement. Guards avoided certain routes. Conversations stopped mid-sentence when particular officers approached. The prison's internal hierarchy, never written, always understood, was being quietly rearranged. In D-19, the inmate with the faded date tattoos sat on his bunk, hands folded, eyes half closed. He'd watched institutions long enough to recognize the pattern. When power lost its confidence, it became sloppy. He thought about the man in D-17. Thought about how calm he'd been in the final years. How he'd stopped filing appeals long before the courts ran out of them. Back then, everyone assumed resignation. Now, it felt like preparation. Investigators turned fully to the past. The original case file was no longer treated as history. It was treated as a crime scene. Every interview transcript was reread, not for what it said, but for what it avoided. Timelines were reconstructed. Names cross-referenced against employment records, transfers, and promotions. One detail stood out. A key interview conducted decades earlier had been summarized instead of transcribed. The summary bore the same former investigator's initials, the one who later consulted for corrections, the same one whose procedural reviews overlapped with death row operations. The witness from that interview had originally placed doubt on the timeline of the crime. That doubt never reached the jury. Inside the prison, an inmate with angular tattoos along his jawline pressed his palms flat against the concrete wall of his cell. He remembered that witness. Remembered the night the man in D-17 had shouted down the tier, furious, not at the sentence, but at the silence that followed. They cut him out, he'd said back then. Just erased him. Now investigators understood what that meant. They traced the witness's life after the trial. Moved locations. Changed names. Short stints in county jails. Then nothing. The death certificate surfaced late in the afternoon. Ruled accidental. No autopsy requested. The phrase from the note, not an accident, gained another layer. Pressure closed in on the uniformed figure from the footage. His recent actions were examined in microscopic detail. Shift swaps. Corridor access. Maintenance proximity. None of it proved guilt alone. Together, it formed a shape too familiar to ignore. Before formal questioning, the prison took protective measures. His access was limited quietly. He was reassigned to administrative duty under the guise of staffing needs. He noticed immediately. Guards always did. Inside the facility, word spread faster than policy could contain it. Tattooed inmates passed the information through glances, timing, the sudden absence of a familiar presence. The man with the tattooed cross in D21 smiled to himself when he realized which officer hadn't walked the tier that morning. They finally saw him, he muttered. That night, the investigators made their move, not on the officer, but on the system that had protected him. They confronted the former investigator. Retirement hadn't dulled his confidence. He spoke carefully, professionally, his answers framed by decades of experience navigating law enforcement scrutiny. He denied wrongdoing, denied pressure, denied interference. His story was clean, too clean. When presented with the recovered footage, he didn't react immediately. A fraction of a second passed, just long enough for trained eyes to notice the calculation. That could be anyone, he said. Investigators slid the note across the table. The numbers, the dates, the phrase. Not an accident. For the first time, his posture shifted. Back in cell block D, an inmate with a skull tattoo curling along his forearm felt the change like a current. The air itself seemed heavier. He leaned against the bars, listening as footsteps moved with purpose rather than routine. He remembered the night the man in D17 had whispered through the bars during a power flicker. They think time protects them, he'd said. It doesn't. It exposes them. The truth emerged slowly, the way it always did in places built to hide it. The original conviction hadn't been fabricated outright. That would have drawn attention. Instead, it had been guided. Evidence emphasized here. Doubt minimized there. A witness discredited quietly. A confession contextualized to fit the narrative. Every step defensible in isolation. Together, devastating. The man in D17 had discovered it years later, while studying his own case with the obsessive focus of someone with nothing left to lose. He'd written letters that went unanswered, filed motions denied without hearings, watched as those connected to his case advanced, retired, or vanished. So he changed strategy. Instead of fighting the sentence, he documented the truth. Dates, names, intersections between law enforcement and corrections. He understood the prison better than anyone. Understood where systems overlapped, where surveillance relied on trust, where small failures could be hidden. His final act hadn't been desperation. It had been exposure. Investigators reconstructed the last weeks of his life. Subtle interactions, requests for legal materials, conversations that, at the time, seemed meaningless. He hadn't been trying to escape the prison. He'd been trying to escape silence. When questioned again, the officer from the footage broke, not with confession, but with fear. His statements contradicted themselves. Timelines shifted. Names surfaced. He wasn't the architect. He was a participant, one who'd believed the system would shield him forever. The former investigator was arrested 2 days later. Inside the prison, the reaction was immediate and contained. Lockdowns tightened. Movements restricted. Guards stood straighter. Inmates grew quieter. Tattooed men who'd survived decades of confinement understood what this meant. The walls hadn't just heard the truth. They'd released it. In D19, the inmate with the faded tattoos lay back on his bunk, staring at the ceiling. Justice, he knew, rarely arrived clean. It limped. It came late. And it never brought back what was lost. But sometimes, just sometimes, it told the story correctly. As the sun set beyond the razor wire, investigators prepared for the final phase. Confessions needed to be secured. Charges finalized. And the public, long convinced the case was closed, would soon learn that an execution had ended a life, but not a lie. The prison returned to its cold blue stillness, but nothing inside it was the same. The truth was no longer contained. It was waiting to be spoken. The final confrontation didn't come with raised voices or drawn weapons. It arrived the way truth usually did inside institutions built on silence. Quietly, formally, wrapped in procedure. By the time the sun rose over the prison for the 5th day in a row under restricted movement, the outcome was already sealed. The former investigator sat in a federal holding room miles away, no longer protected by titles or legacy. The corrections officer whose shadow had appeared on the recovered footage was placed on administrative leave, then formally charged before nightfall. The machinery of accountability moved with a steadiness that felt almost foreign to everyone involved. For the first time in decades, the story was no longer controlled by the system alone. Investigators laid everything out methodically. The reconstructed timeline, the suppressed interview, the manipulated emphasis in the original trial, the quiet cooperation between individuals who never believed they'd be questioned together. Each piece alone seemed explainable. Together, they formed a criminal motive rooted not in malice, but in preservation, careers protected, reputations shielded, outcomes justified after the fact. The death on death row had not been an accident. It had been an attempt to keep the story closed. Inside cell block D, the man with the faded date tattoos stood for count, eyes forward, posture rigid. He'd spent years assuming the truth would die with the man in D17. He hadn't believed in last moves or long games. He believed in walls. Now he knew better. That distinction mattered. Public reaction was swift once the findings were released. Headlines questioned certainty. Commentators argued timelines. Families on all sides were forced to relive wounds they'd assumed were settled. The case became what no one inside the prison ever wanted it to be again, alive. Inside the facility, guards returned slowly to standard rotations. Surveillance systems were overhauled. Maintenance protocols rewritten. Training updated. On paper, the prison adapted. But prisons remembered. The man in D17's cell was gone, but his presence lingered. Investigators left the cell sealed for weeks, untouched, as if the space itself held testimony. When it was finally cleared, nothing remarkable was found. No hidden compartments, no weapons, no secrets left behind. Only a faint outline on the wall where paper had once been taped. Not an accident. He denied causing the death directly. Investigators didn't argue. The evidence spoke where words failed. The former investigator's trial would take years. Appeals would follow. Arguments would echo familiar phrases about intent and context. Justice, once delayed, rarely hurried. Inside the prison, inmates returned to their routines. Tattoos aged. Lights flickered. Doors opened and closed. Life resumed its narrow path. But something had changed in the air. Men who'd spent lifetimes believing their stories didn't matter now knew that one man, facing the end, had forced the truth into the open, not by escaping the prison, but by understanding it better than anyone else. In D19, the inmate with the faded tattoos lay back on his bunk, staring at the ceiling. He thought about how long it had taken, about how many years the truth had waited, about how the system had almost succeeded in burying it. Almost. The case would be studied, debated, cited in reports and reforms. But inside these walls, it would be remembered differently, as a reminder that even the most controlled environments carried cracks, and that patience could be a weapon when nothing else remained. The prison settled back into its blue-toned stillness, cameras humming, guards walking familiar routes. On paper, order had been restored, but one detail refused to disappear. The man executed after decades on death row had stopped fighting his sentence long before the end. He had chosen not to save himself, but to tell the story in a way no appeal ever could. If this prison case stunned you, the next one will be even darker. Subscribe so you don't miss it.